Hi, I'm a wannabe ripoff of much better YouTubers. Let's talk about Murs. So Murs is a pretty respected rapper. He also works on the Hip Hop DX Breakdown series where he replaced the great Justin Hunt. Go check him out, he's pretty cool. And most of the time I do like his stuff. In fact, he's done some great videos about the history of rap around the world, the element of basketball and hip hop, the mental depression a lot of people have that is really impressive, etc. But then he made a video discussing classic albums and why it's only going to be determined after 10 years, which I found was pretty uncomfortable. In fact, similarly, the one he made before about how you have to be 20 years into the game to actually be one of the greatest in a genre that's only 30 years old, I also disagreed with. But I just want to note that this is not an attack on the guy. He seems really cool and he often asks for discussions. So, in other words, I'm saying fuck no.
Have y'all heard that new Ye? It's a classic. Kendrick and Cole been dropping classics back to back. Cudi, he been dropping classics since day one. Everyone has heard those phrases. But what does the term classic actually mean? There are classic cars, which by most automobile association standards is a car over 20 years old. There's classical music, which is commonly used to describe any music composed hundreds of years ago by old European men in wigs. But technically, classical is just one period from that style of music, which lasted roughly from 1750 to 1830 and was preceded by the Baroque era and followed by the Romantic.
So you ignore the fact that classical also has a definition as symphonic music, and that modern classical has been made and has a somewhat notable movement. Hence why the Grammys have a Best Classical Performance category, and why artists such as Niels Fromm, Max Richter, and the late Johan Johansson are making music very similar to what is traditionally called classical, just with modern effects like electronic music added into it.
Anyway, there's also classic rock, which generally means rock from the mid-60s to the late 80s. But there are also modern artists like Jack White, Gary Clark Jr., the Black Keys, and Kings of Leon, who are considered by some to be classic rock because they have a similar sound, even though they aren't from that era.
So basically AOR, or Oriented Rock if you're kind of a nerd. Does Nirvana count, since that's considered the end of classic rock? How about Oasis? They were certainly influenced by that kind of sound. Are they classic rock? I don't know.
I'm hoping the term classic rap or classic hip hop will do away with the term backpack rap.
But backpack rap doesn't always mean the retro-inspired hip-hop. Are you going to say that Digable Planets and MF Doom and the Open Mic Eagle are the same as Grandmaster Flash and NWA?
I love you.
You also need to allow time to see how the work has affected the landscape of the culture. Let's go back to classic cars for an example. Here's a Range Rover from 1998, which is technically now a classic.
Actually, technically that car is a young timer. A car 15 to 25 years old is technically called a young timer since it doesn't fit the classics according to the AACA, or the Antique Automobile Club of America, where it has to be 25 years or older. Now I'm going to be fast forwarding through a good amount of this next minute and a half, but I want to mention one thing. Hamilton is in the top 10 biggest of last year. And Murs considers Hamilton to be a classic in the video where he says Lin-Manuel Miranda should be in your top 5 and praises the show. So wouldn't that be a modern classic, since you've already said how good of an impact it has and how relevant it is now?
I love you.
Let's take a look at the top albums of 2007. According to Billboard, the top 10 albums of 2007 are as follows: Kingdom Come, Graduation, Inspiration, T.I. vs. Tip, Curtis, Doctor's Advocate, Hip Hop is Dead, Blue Carpet Treatment, Like Father Like Son, and Eminem Presents The Re-Up. Now, let's look at 2017. You have Damn, More Life, Stoney, Culture, Hamilton, an American Musical, and believe me, no one saw that coming back in 2007. Future, For Your Eyes Only, Views, Everybody, I Decided. As you can see, not one artist from the top 10 in 2007 made it into the top 10 of 2017.
Because not everyone is making albums every single year, sales records can change when newer albums come and take a spotlight, or a new sound different from what those artists have been doing is now coming up and the old sound is disappearing on pop radio. Plus, there is still some kind of transition between the old and the new. Drake alone is a major example. For a long time he was the signee of Lil Wayne and basically the successor, as well as trap music sounds still being done through guys like Migos and Future, where they were previously done by T.I. and Young Jeezy. And conscious hip-hop like Nas has been done through someone like Kendrick or J. Cole.
In just 10 years, the field changed completely. If that was that Range Rover, it would have went from an SUV to a convertible coupe.
Which is why Jay-Z released an album critics and audiences loved, and Kanye is still making music that's at least appreciated.
But why 10 years? Why not 5 years? Let's take a look at the Billboard charts from 2012. As you can see, it's still mixed. Ross, Wayne, Hov, and Nas are still present, but sliding down a bit, while Kendrick, Drake, Cole, and Future are just beginning their climb.
Wait a minute, now you show the top 20 instead of just the top 10? Well, in 2017 example, Jay-Z was still in the top 20 with 444, and he was one of the few people on a 2007 list that was actually had an album that year. Who knows what would happen if Kanye, T.I., Wayne, or any of those others had a recent album that year? I mean, Ye and Kids See Ghosts are already going to be a good example of that next year.
Not enough time for a complete changing of the guard.
But do we need a complete change of guard to make sure an album is a classic? If it's influenced a good amount of sound after a few years, shouldn't it already be worthy of a classic? Many say Good Kid, Mad City is also a classic, which includes the great Justin Hunt Go Watch His Video, and that's because it was impossible to find flaws with the album, and has went to influence a ton of the future stuff in the genre.
But back to 2007, with that decade of perspective, how many classic albums do you see on this list? I say one, Graduation, that's it. But at the time, I'm sure you would have found a couple of people arguing for other albums on this list.
Nas was on a weird streak, and people were calling his Best in a While but not a classic. Lil Wayne and Birdman got mixed reviews. Kingdom Come was a horrible comeback to many people, and he didn't make a borderline classic until American Gangster. Curtis had much lower sales after his first week because of mediocrity. Just a few examples.
Why are we even having this argument at all? Where did the rush to call something a classic come from?
Because hype exists and people like an album a lot. Those are pretty simple things.
Why can't we just be like other genres and enjoy an album for a few years, wait for it to settle in, and then one day look up and be like, hey, that's a pretty cool fucking record, man. It's pretty classic.
This is actually something with all genres. I don't think many people were waiting 10 years to call Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band a classic. Critics unanimously agreed it was amazing.
In my opinion, it all started with the Source magazine and their much celebrated and often debated 5 mic rating, which they gave to denote a classic. They gave it to quite a few albums over the years, 43 to be exact.
Technically 45, but I'm guessing you're imposing your only after 10 years rule. And actually only 15 of those 45 were actually on their release date. The others were done as corrections to previous failures where they didn't give it a classic when everyone agreed it should be. And most of them are actually undeniable. See Doggy Style, see Eric B. and Rakim, see all of those people.
Which included albums released from 1984 to 2005.
Only if you include the retrospective classics, it's really more 1990 to 2010, a full 20 years of doing perfect scores, which is a lot easier to calculate. But seeing later on, I kind of see why he chose that time. And it's not for a good reason.
By comparison, in that same amount of time, Rolling Stone magazine, which reviews all genres of music and was published twice a month, only gave 35 classic ratings. In hindsight, I feel it's safe to say the Source was a little loose with their classics.
There are a lot of mathematical ways to look at this. Using Best Ever Albums list of Rolling Stone perfect scores, yes, in that time period there is way less than 43 or 45. But if you look at 1990 to 2010, since these are the actual times they were releasing perfect scores on release dates, Rolling Stone was actually a lot more liberal with their scores, as they gave 21 perfect scores compared to 15. Hell, let's include those 30 albums that got retrospectively praised as classics compared to the initial 10 out of 10 classics. You get a whopping 41, only 4 less than what the Source gave out, and that's immediately on release.
Out of all the reviews in the history of the Source magazine, I feel there were 2 in particular that drove this culture into its current state of classic craziness. Those reviews were the review of Dr. Dre's The Chronic and Nas's Illmatic. A couple of months before The Chronic hit the streets, it was reviewed in the Source and praised with a very solid rating of 4.5 mics, which is cool.
Fun fact, The Chronic is on a list of albums that were later given a 5. Funny when later on he says that they got it wrong the first time, and now it looks like they agreed.
But months later, when rookie sensation Nas was given a 5 mic classic rating for his debut 9-song LP, the hip-hop community was in an uproar. The Chronic was made by Dr. Dre, who was already a hip-hop legend, gave birth to G-Funk, a new label called Death Row, one of the biggest, if not the biggest star in hip-hop, Snoop Dogg, also stars like Corrupt, Daz, Lady of Rage, and Warren G. How could somebody's first album ever be called a classic? and one of the most important and highest selling albums in hip hop history missed being a certified classic by half a mic.
Because the Source had a big no fives rule at the time, but John Schechter insisted on Illmatic getting a 5 because it was just that amazing at the time. They also didn't want to give it a 5 because of the infamous East Coast-West Coast rivalry that was big back then. To the point where people were claiming that the Source had an East Coast bias. And plus, even if The Chronic wasn't as great as it was, being influential in other ways does not make your album perfect. If the Source actually felt like The Chronic was not as good as Illmatic, that is perfectly fine. Especially since they agreed with the consensus that it was a really good album.
Fuck no. Fuck that shit.
On the Chronic side of things, you have fools that are like, fuck it, the Source didn't get it right, so I'm gonna take matters into my own hands and start calling out classics as I see fit. On the Illmatic side of things, you have those who are inspired by the Source's foresight and ability to crown a classic that no one saw coming.
So shouldn't that be kind of proof that something can be called a classic that fast? If people want to immediately say something like Daytona or Good Kid, Mad City are automatic classics, you can't really judge them because in some ways they are classics to people. Similarly, there's very little uproar about My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy getting a 10 out of 10, and that's already a full-on classic to many eyes.
This created the type of head that'll break their neck to be the first to listen to something just to say that they were the first to call it a classic. Whatever side you fall on, at this point, everyone in the hip-hop community was a legit critic, and the advent of the internet only made it worse. Nowadays, when something's released at midnight Eastern Standard Time, it's hashtag classic before the sun even comes up.
So there are a lot of fans that will praise an album immediately. That's just the standard fan base. What a shocker that popular artists like J. Cole, Drake, Travis Scott, and Pusha T's news albums get called classic because that's the basic idea of a hype cycle. After a few days, people will reach a general consensus and it will not be worth putting a fuss over. You're basically nitpicking about people having an initial opinion.
So, is Daytona an instant classic like Black Twitter says? Is 444 a classic already?
Well, those are definitely going to be albums that are considered the best of their respective years. If you don't think it's a classic, that's perfectly fine, but it's not worth complaining about people calling it a classic. Speaking of Jay-Z, this isn't a hip-hop thing either. Seeing as his R&B wife, Beyonce's newest solo album, Lemonade, was considered a classic in many people's fans' and critics' eyes.
I got some young homies that'll say Rodeo by Travis Scott is a classic. It's not my cup of tea per se, but hey, I can't deny the impact, so maybe.
Actually, that album has not had as much of an impact as you think. It's more his involvement with something like Yeezus that's really been the influencer, since Young Thug and Future and similar artists have had a similar kind of trap sound that Travis Scott has already had. In fact, this flowchart I had said it was basically just Yeezus mixed with Young Thug. I think the better example would more be something like Dirty Spray 2 or Migos' Culture.
What about Section 80, Good Kid, Mad City, To Pimp a Butterfly, and damn, Mr. Lamar seems to be outdoing himself every album. Will his future classics out-classic his old classics?
Maybe he will make an album that's better than Good Kid, Mad City or To Pimp a Butterfly, but most critics seem to think those are already his classic watermarks. To Pimp a Butterfly is already the highest rated hip-hop album since Outkast, and though many people think Damn is an instant classic, some people said it was not as good as the others, such as Spectral Pulse, Anthony Fantano, Pitchfork, and AllMusic. And your friend Justin Hunt already did a great piece on why Good Kid, Mad City is already still definitely a classic that already basically critiques your video. I'll give it a link in the description.
Honestly, who knows? Only time will tell. Look, we all know we have albums that we love every song on today that we won't feel the same about next year. We also know there are albums that take a couple years to grow on you. And I think today I've proven to you that a decade is enough time to let it breathe before you try to call something a classic.
But what about an album like Drake's Take Care or early Kid Cudi albums, which were immediately called a classic? You're just making a joke about how Cudi made classic after classic.
Cudi? He been dropping classics since day one.
He has definitely influenced the modern sound to the point where it's almost as expected to be a classic a la The Chronic. What about that?
But I've also come up with some solid criteria to help clear up the classic confusion. And this week, I put it in black and white for y'all. To most of y'all, a classic is if you constantly listen to an album and it still slap, it's a classic.
Which is why everyone calls old Lil Jon albums classics. Wait a minute.
No. The true definition is content, longevity, artistry, sound, style, and innovation equals a classic.
So basically, Take Care, the last 3 Kendrick albums, almost all of Kanye West's work that came out before this video, Run the Jewels 2, I Wonder if Channel Orange counts as hip hop, Acid Rap, I Don't Like Shit I Don't Go Outside, And so many other albums that are really popular. I'm running out of ideas.